So I'm very glad to have the chance to address you today from Boston, and hope you are enjoying the conference to this point. I want to spend a little time to raise some questions and concerns and offer some criteria for minimizing damage where open badges are concerned. And also to offer some background about the psychological research and theory that informs my cautions. And I hope you will forgive me if some of these discussions about the research are already familiar to some of you, because I'm not in the room with you and can't judge really what the extent of that familiarity is. So with some of you, this will seem a needless repetition. For others of you, it may be surprising, and I will look forward to your questions if I don't offer a sufficient amount of background. So with the concept of open badges, I should begin by saying, as an outsider, if you will, a critical friend of the idea, that it does seem reasonable to me that because some learning takes place out of school and outside of traditional institutions, that it is reasonable to recognize and certify that learning. And I believe that that's part of the impetus, part of the motivation for creating open badges in the first place. So that fundamental premise that informs it seems to me a reasonable and legitimate one. There's a legitimate societal interest in offering something like a diploma at the end of a program of study to certify that one has met certain criteria, that one has acquired certain proficiencies, assuming those criteria are meaningful, of course. But as soon as you raise the idea, as soon as you pull back from it, important questions begin to appear immediately, even for someone who doesn't have a background in the psychological theory that may raise concern. For example, obviously you want to ask, which skills are we certifying with these badges, and what are the criteria for mastery? And more importantly, who gets to decide that? That's true, that question about decision, both in the broad sense and in the narrow sense. The broad sense are, what are the policies that are going to inform the application or implementation of badges across the board? And it's true in the narrow sense of who gets to decide whether a specific badge has been earned by a specific person. Broadly speaking, one can imagine a doing to model or a working with model, which I use to apply to a variety of issues, from management in corporations to parenting to education. And in this case, a doing to model would be something comes fully formed in terms of what you have to do to get a badge and whether you have succeeded in doing it. Those criteria are laid out by distant authorities, whereas a working with model would suggest that the person earning the badges has a significant role in making those decisions, both in the narrow and in the broad sense. A second important question, maybe more important even than the implementation, is the question of goal. And whenever someone presents me with an idea and says, this is the hot new thing, I respond with a Latin question, which is cui bono, which means who benefits from this? Who's it for? Is the idea of open badges something that's intended to benefit the badge earner, him or herself? A kind of innocuous reminder of one's accomplishment to permit you to have a quiet sense of pride in what you have mastered? If that's the goal, if it's the badge earner who primarily benefits from the whole apparatus, then I'm not so concerned. But is there some external constituency that needs to know who's attained what competence at a given point in time? And if so, who really needs to know that? And why? And I think it is reasonable to be skeptical about the whole idea until that question has been satisfactorily answered, even if that doesn't make us suspicious as such. Worse than the idea of a constituency that just wants to know is the idea that this whole movement is driven to some extent by corporations that stand to profit, both from the badges themselves and from using them to induce people to do something. So, for example, even if the whole system of awarding badges is done by a not-for-profit organization like Mozilla, does some entity benefit from people's having been awarded these badges? Is the point to lure people to master some set of skills and retain those people, to use the badges to make them want to keep doing it? Is there anyone other than the badge owner who stands to benefit from this? And is that benefit financial? You know, when we talk about certification of career-oriented skills, there's a need for certification. Even as someone who is deeply concerned about the use of grades or marks in a school setting, I recognize that if we're going to hire someone to be a dentist or a lifeguard, you want some system to certify who has mastered the skills to be able to practice dentistry or is qualified to be a lifeguard. So I guess my question to open badges advocates is there really something parallel here where we would really need to know who's mastered which skills outside of a professional or career setting? I'm asking whether they're really necessary. And if not, then why do we want to risk the potential negative effects of this setup, which I'm going to talk about in a minute? If those are the basic questions that I think one should ask, then we can move on to something a little stronger in the way of cautions. Likely problems that may well develop where the burden is on a proponent of badges to address these likely concerns. So here's one. Sometimes I think we do need to go beyond traditional institutions, but the desire to do that in other domains, at least in the United States, where I'm most familiar with the history, has sometimes shaded into an attempt to do something that troubles me greatly. For example, take the institution of bitcoins, which has developed as an alternative to traditional exchange of currency. Many of the people who have latched onto this are doing so not for convenience or because there is a legitimate need to go beyond currency, but because of a passionate political desire to undermine democratically elected governments. There is a libertarian sensibility that has led us to say we have to go beyond the traditional institution. I don't know how you feel about that ideology. It concerns me, but we should be aware that that's what's driving it. It's not mere convenience or benefit to those who use bitcoins. Let me give you another example. In the United States, there's an active move on the part of some individuals and institutions to undermine traditional university schools of education that train and certify elementary and secondary teachers. And the push to provide alternative methods of certifying teachers comes from an attempt to undermine a great deal of democratic public schooling, not only the universities that train the teachers. Many of those folks also strongly support a voucher system that privatizes education. And quietly, many people don't recognize this, promotes a different pedagogical agenda. So, for example, most of the folks, or at least many of the folks, who are pushing in this direction for alternative modes of certification of teachers have a different idea of what it means to be a good teacher, where the emphasis is not on helping them to know what it means to learn and to know about pedagogy itself, but rather proceed from the assumption that teaching is about transmitting a bunch of facts and skills so that anyone who's knowledgeable about science is qualified to be a science teacher. Same for mathematics or history or whatever. An attempt to minimize the significance of understanding how learning itself happens. And the more you undermine the traditional institutions of teacher education programs in an attempt to create these alternatives, the more you push for a very different and I think very suspect model of teaching. Now, it may be that open badges is not at all analogous to that or to the Bitcoin example. But for me, it's a significant caution. What does it mean here to go beyond traditional institutions of certification? And is there another agenda lurking in the shadows? A second caution about this is the possibility that when open badges are created, we will merely be reproducing the worst of what happens already in schools and institutions. Here, the analogy that comes to mind, again educational, is traditional versions of homeschooling, where parents teach their kids instead of putting kids in some kind of traditional school. Now, some people do that for more progressive reasons and with more progressive methods, but some people do it for very traditionalist reasons and with very traditionalist methods. So, for example, children are sitting around the kitchen table being drilled in facts with workbooks and being forced to take tests and get grades. So the institution of homeschooling that was set up as an alternative ends up merely reproducing what was done in schools, and in my opinion, the worst of what was done in schools. Could that be the case for open badges? Well, I have to tell you, I'm not reassured by the fact that Khan Academy has enthusiastically embraced the idea of open badges. Khan Academy is a series of videotapes to instruct kids primarily in mathematics. And some schools are using this in what they call a flipped approach to education, where the kids watch these lectures at home and then do something other than listen to lectures at school. I find this pretty disturbing, frankly, because it only changes where and when traditional methods of instruction take place, and also underscore the whole institution of homework, which says that kids have to work a second shift after they get home from a full day in school. Khan Academy represents to me the worst of painting a kind of modern, technological, superficial patina on very traditional approaches to education while presenting it as a hip new idea. If they like open badges, I'm worried. Here's another important caution. It makes sense, of course, to decentralize much of what happens with open badges, so there isn't a central authority making all the decisions about issuing badges. But the trade-off here is that the more it's decentralized, the more sharply the decisions will diverge, both the criteria for earning a badge and the approach for awarding badges. So One way of putting it, a sort of negative way, is to suggest it's kind of a dilemma. Either you've got a doing to centralized model for consistency, or you've got a decentralized approach where people are doing it in very different ways and using very different standards, so the whole institution may collapse of its own chaotic weight. I suppose a more positive way to put that is to say it's a balance that has to be struck, but a very difficult one, it seems to me. And here I know less than many of you. You may have already come up with a solution to that problem that I'm unaware of, in which case I'd be keen to hear about it. Here's my last caution, which will lead me into the next and I think most significant part of what I want to share with you today. And that caution is, if the concept of open badges appeals to people who rally behind the banner of gamification, then I think we're in real trouble. Gamification, in fact, if badges are in any way connected to that trend, in the way that they're used, we need to watch out. Because every aspect of gamification, or almost every aspect, which is an attempt, as you know, to take certain methods and assumptions built into video games and apply them outside the world of video games, in the workplace and in education in particular, deeply concerns me. And what I want to talk about now is why it concerns me. And why I'm worried about certain aspects of open badges, potentially, even if it's not about gamification. And this requires some of the theory and research having to do with psychology and education that I spoke of at the beginning. Why should badges elicit skepticism? And why should gamification elicit strong opposition? When people talk about the need to motivate other people to pursue a task, to acquire mastery of a skill in a workplace or educational or other setting, that's our first cue that something is very wrong in terms, or lacking in the understanding of psychology on the people who talk that way. When there is a discussion about motivation as though it were a single entity that you can have more of or less of, thus awarding people points, awarding them some sort of status, cards, rarities of items, different levels, the things that are done in most video games. The attempt here is to say we're going to motivate people to pursue and persist. But for several decades, psychologists have realized that there are, in fact, different kinds of motivation. And in fact, the kind matters more than the amount. Most commonly, psychologists talk about intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And like all dichotomies, that too is an oversimplification, but it's a lot closer to the truth than a single entity model that says motivation is on a hydraulic lift and it can go up and it can come down. We want people to have more of this stuff called motivation, so let's gamify and give them points and status and levels and rewards. Intrinsic motivation, if you need a quick refresher course in this, is a fancy term that means you really like what you're doing for its own sake. You read a book because you love reading, or because you want to know what happens to this character, or because you love this writer. Extrinsic motivation means that something outside the task is being used to induce you to do it. So for example, in the worst schools, kids may get grades or points or food or recognition of some kind or even money for reading books. That's an extrinsic motivation. And the same is true for anything, for being helpful and generous. I can help you because you need the help, or because I think that's the way people ought to live their lives, is by being generous. Or I can help you because I hope that somebody catches me being good and gives me some recognition, some extrinsic inducement. It doesn't have to be money. It doesn't have to be points. It could just be a verbal doggy biscuit, as in, good job. I really like how generous you were, which we do to children. Or recognition ceremonies that we do to adults sometimes, which amount to treating people like pets, giving them the equivalent of some sort of dog treat when they jump through our hoops and fulfill our interests. Now, psychologists have found three things with respect to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. First, they're different. The only people who deny that are hardcore behaviorists, following the work of the late American psychologist B.F. Skinner, who did most of his research with rodents and pigeons and wrote most of his books about people. Second, psychologists talk about the fact that intrinsic motivation is more powerful, which is to say, it works better. Motivation is deeper when it's intrinsic, which is to say, no artificial inducement, no gamification strategy can possibly equal the power of people who love what they're doing for its own sake. The people who do the best jobs at work are typically those who love their jobs. That doesn't mean they don't want to be paid. It doesn't even mean necessarily they wouldn't like to be paid more. But it means that no amount of money or other inducement can compensate for the lack of interest in what they're doing. But it's the third finding about motivation that's really most interesting. And that is that extrinsic inducements, like rewards, aren't just less effective. They are corrosive. They're counterproductive. They do damage to intrinsic motivation. This is one of the most thoroughly replicated findings in the field of social psychology. More than 100 studies by now, across cultures, across ages, across genders, across tasks, and across types of rewards, have found something that I can summarize in one sentence. The more you reward people for doing something, the more you reduce their interest in whatever they had to do to get the reward. So if you imagine two hydraulic lifts, this is it for fancy audio visuals for this presentation, by the way. Extrinsic motivation can go up and down. Intrinsic motivation can go up and down. But as extrinsic motivation goes up, intrinsic motivation tends to fall. Tends to. There are few absolutes in human behavior, except that sentence. But in general, the more you reward people for doing something, the more their intrinsic motivation tends to decline. So people who used to do something because it was fun and intriguing, once they get a reward for doing it, are now less likely to go back to doing it. Now they're going to ask, what do I get for doing it? They used to find the game fun. They used to find reading enjoyable. The best way to destroy children's interest in books is to give them a reward for reading books. Because now they'll only read, in general, as long as you keep offering the reward. Possibly greater and greater rewards, in fact. And then when the rewards are gone, they're likely to have lost the interest they had to begin with. Research has found this across domains. And only people who think about motivation as a single entity failed to recognize the destructive, and I mean consistently destructive effects of rewards on interest, which incidentally often leads to a destructive effect on the quality of performance, particularly when there is a degree of creativity or innovation that is required. In other words, the more challenging and innovative the task, the more rewards tend to destroy quality of performance. That's true for various reasons, but one of the most powerful reasons is because it has undermined intrinsic interest. So, for example, as Lauren Resnick, one of our leading cognitive scientists, has put it, quote, simply engaging students is not enough. They need to be engaged for the right reasons. I'm sorry, I made a mistake there. That was not, I wrote down Resnick in my notes. That wasn't Lauren Resnick, who's a cognitive scientist. That was Mitchell Resnick, the director of the Media Lab at MIT, who's one of our leading authorities in helping kids and grown-ups, for that matter, engage in really exciting and interesting ways of thinking about stuff using computers. He says, never reward people for becoming active in computer programming or computer games. He has a lot more authority than I do, so his skepticism is worth taking seriously. In fact, the basic computer programming language that he and his colleagues came up with, called Scratch, would be thought to be a natural breeding ground for open badges, and in fact, he's as skeptical as I am about the whole idea. Why do rewards undermine interest? I have two hypotheses based on my reading of the research. And there's loads more on all of this, including the supporting data, in a book I wrote a long time ago called Punished by Rewards, as well as in some updated articles I've written. And other people have used some of that same research more recently. People like Daniel Pink and others have plowed that same ground again, especially with a management setting, in a management setting. So one reason rewards undermine interest is because they're experienced as controlling, which is to say, people don't like to feel like pawns, to feel like somebody is manipulating them. So even though you want the goodie, whatever that is, the money or the praise or the grade, you don't want to have things you like turned into a means to be controlled by somebody else. You want to feel a sense of autonomy. And let me be very clear about this, because some gamification people boast about the respects in which people playing the game have control over the whole mechanism and when they get to earn the points and what level they want to shoot for. That limited degree of choice does not compensate for the inherently damaging effects of gamification itself and its reliance on extrinsic inducements. A second reason why I think rewards undermine interest is because anything you do that becomes a means to an end devalues the means. So if, for example, I tell my son, honey, I want you to do all of your math homework, and if you do it all, including the extra credit problem, you get to watch an extra hour of television tonight. What's the likely message that I'm teaching here? Math stinks. What he hears is, if you have to reward me for doing this, it must be something I wouldn't want to do. And that's a different reason why rewards prove destructive, besides just the effect of autonomy. In the case of grades that are given in school, which are analogous perhaps to open badges, research has found three robust effects of giving rewards. Of giving grades or marks in schools. First, they undermine interest in learning. To the best of my knowledge, every study that has looked at the effect of grades on students' interest in learning, little children and university students and everyone in between, has found a negative effect on desire to learn when there are no grades around. Second, grades tend to lead students to prefer the easiest possible task if given a choice. Not because they're lazy, but because they're rational. The message they get is, duh, if I want to get a higher grade, I'm going to pick the shortest book or the easiest project because that maximizes my chance of getting that grade. And the third effect of grades is that it undermines the depth of thinking and leads students to think in a more superficial fashion. Thus, it may be possible to assess students to promote learning with mechanisms other than grades. But the idea of grading to promote learning makes about as much sense, if I may recycle an old 60s expression, as much sense as bombing for peace. And to that extent, because it's an oxymoron, that would be true for badges. The idea of using badges to promote lifelong learning is an incoherent notion from a psychological point of view, to the extent that badges are used to induce people to do something, or to put it differently, is to reward them. So beware of anyone who talks about the best way to reward a skill, or you should reward only what counts. In other words, figuring out the right way to make the rewards work. If they're focusing on the details of how to reward, look out, because they've missed the fact that rewards are inherently counterproductive. You can't do them right because of the problematic psychological theory on which all rewards are based. So if badges amount to a jazzy reward structure for the digital age, get rid of them fast. However, with praise, for example, which I don't have time to talk about here, unlike tangible rewards, I think there are gray areas, and a lot depends on the motive of the giver and the perceptions of the recipient. And so here, it might be possible with open badges to do them in a way that's not as problematic if you do them very carefully, and there's nothing similar to gamification within them. Two more points about the general theory, and then I'm going to close with a quick list of criteria that I would suggest we apply in thinking about how open badges might get better or worse. Second, very quick point here. This is an hour-and-a-half presentation I'm going to do in less than a minute. Beyond the question of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is a fundamental question of whether people are being led to focus on what they're doing, the task, or on how well they're doing it, which is to say their level of achievement. Different psychologists have used different language to describe this. I won't bother with the other vocabulary or a list of the pedigree here. Suffice it to say that it's very different for people to focus on the task itself as opposed to focusing on their level of accomplishment at the task. And what I always tell teachers is, when you lead students to focus too much on levels of achievement, how good am I at this? They tend not to be engaged in the learning itself. And the more concerned you are about the learning as an end in itself, the more you should minimize any focus on how am I doing at this. You can see that that would inherently damn the concept of gamification and rewards. Question, what effect does it have on open badges? Third point, with respect to the theory is the only thing worse than a reward is an award. An award is a reward that all of us can't attain, which is to say, we are in competition against one another. So that if I succeed, it reduces or even eliminates the chance that you can succeed. We are working at cross purposes, and I now have a built-in inducement to want you to fail. Not because I'm a neurotic or malicious or sadistic person, but because someone has set up a contest, and it's no longer about excellence, it's about victory. Those are two completely different concepts, and in practice, they often pull in opposite directions. That's another whole book that I wrote, even before Punished by Rewards, with its own significant collection of data to support the idea that competition doesn't just undermine psychological health or our relationships with one another. How could relationships not suffer when they teach the lesson that other people are obstacles to my own success, thereby undermining cooperation? But competition also tends to undermine excellence. Even I was surprised to find this research when I began that project. I knew they were bad news psychologically and interpersonally, but I thought competition motivated some people to do their best. What the research tends to show is that competition tends to undermine excellence, particularly where creativity and open-ended thinking is required. The lack of competition tends to be more successful with such tasks, and cooperation, which is more than the absence of competition, tends to be ideal. But cooperation is actively discouraged from any kind of competitive structure. And so now finally, since I have left about, I think, a little less than 10 minutes, I want to suggest degrees of harm, which is to say, it isn't all or nothing in the way in doing open badges. It's not all good or bad. It can be better or worse. So one way of thinking about what I'm about to say is a short list of criteria to apply. You can take an innocuous thing and make it destructive, or you can take a bad thing and make it worse if one of the following is done. Number one, open badges are set up in any way to create that artificial scarcity or contest. When I was first introduced to the concept of open badges, I was kind of reassured when I was told that badges are not inherently competitive, and my getting one doesn't reduce the chance of your getting one. So I would say to you, if you're in this movement, don't screw it up by publicly posting who's acquired how many badges. Any kind of public notification like this will turn it into a de facto competition and will then add the arsenic of competition to the strychnine of extrinsic motivators. Nothing that looks like a competition. Otherwise, this will become as destructive as some of the worst practices in our schools and workplaces. Second, don't make the badge too salient, too obvious. Don't push it into people's faces. Don't make them think about them, especially in advance. Research shows that the worst form of rewards are those that are contracted for. If you do this, you will get that. That will turn it into a doggy biscuit. Make sure that badges are used only to certify proficiency. It should never become the reason to acquire the skill. If it's used to induce people to try something or to keep at it, then it's become, by definition, an extrinsic reward. And that's what you don't want. Don't give out too many badges. If you give a badge at each separate step of the process, it becomes an extrinsic inducement. And don't put too much emphasis on them. Have the focus be on what they're doing, not on how well they're doing. And then at the end, by the way, congratulations, here's a badge to show that you've mastered this. And now I want to move on to engage in something else. Don't use it to manipulate. Don't even allow people to infer that they're being manipulated, even if that wasn't your intention. Next, if you're going to destroy people's interest in it, you would be minimizing their choice. Which tasks, how many levels, and planning the criteria for the badges. So it will become less destructive if the people earning the badges have maximum autonomy and opportunity to make the decisions about the badge process. But as I said before, just that choice isn't enough to overcome the problems if it comes to be seen as a reward, or worse, a contest. Next, I would be very careful about using badges with younger children, because with younger children, there is even more lack of symmetry between the badge giver and the badge getter, and there's even more opportunity, according to research, for them to see the task as just a means to an end, rather than an end in its own right, and to feel controlled by older people who set up the system. Second, never give secondary rewards, which is to say a reward for having earned a reward. In other words, if I get a bunch of badges, I get another second level certification, which makes the whole process even more salient. And finally, maybe most importantly, I don't know, don't do a hierarchy of badges with gradations of excellence. So it looks like grades, where students can get marked. You got a 1 to 100, or a 1 to a 6, or an A, B, C, D, or F, or an exceeds expectations, meets expectations, falls short of expectations. The more gradations, the more of a destructive extrinsic motivator it becomes. Make open badges like pass, fail. Either you got it or you didn't get it yet. An educator who's a friend of mine heard about open badges, and his first question was, oh my God, how long until we start hearing charges of badge inflation? Meaning, by analogy, grade inflation. You don't have to work hard enough to get a badge these days, unlike when I was a kid, and so on. So that list of criteria can be a list of warnings. Here's how to really screw it up. Or flip it inside out and say, the more you append to these, the better the opportunity there is to make open badges something helpful, or at least innocuous, and not something like gamification, which is about treating people as if they're rats in cages. I look forward to your responses and questions.